Thank you so much to everybody for joining us. We have a really wonderful presentation for you today. We have Frank and Robbie who are here from Egale, who have a lot of really incredible things to share with us. If you have any trouble at all with your webinar browser, what can be really helpful is to just close the screen and then restart it over again. I'm going to be monitoring from the other side of the room, so if you need any help, or have any issues with sound or with the video, just feel free to type again in that little bottom chat box. But otherwise, we're ready to get started, and I'm going to leave it to Frank and Robbie.
Thanks, Marvella. Hey, folks. Thanks for joining today, and welcome to the webinar. I'll get started. I'll just let you know that we're here with the Embodiment Body Positivity webinar from the Embodiment Project, which is by Egale and hosted by NEDIC, the National Eating Disorder Information Center. We'll start by telling you a little bit about Egale. Egale is a national charity that works to improve the lives of LGBTQI2S people by informing public policy, inspiring cultural change, and promoting human rights inclusion through research, education, and community engagement. Egale's vision is a Canada and ultimately a world without homophobia, biphobia, and transphobia and all other forms of oppression, so that every person can achieve their full potential, free from hatred and bias.
So before starting the webinar, we'd like to make a land acknowledgement. This land is the territory of the Huron-Wendat and the Petun First Nations, the Seneca, the Haudenosaunee, and the Mississaugas of the Credit River. The territory is the subject of the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, an agreement between the Haudenosaunee Confederacy and Confederacy of the Anishinaabe and allied nations to peacefully share and care for the resources around the Great Lakes. Today, the meeting place of Toronto is still the home to many Indigenous people from across the Turtle Island.
Thanks, Robbie. And some housekeeping, you are able to ask any question at any time, just type it in. We'll see if we can address them during the webinar. If not, we can get to them at the end. We do have a lot of content to go through. We'll be recording this for future viewings as well. And then we also have some resources available, which we'll share with you after the webinar.
All right, so before we start, we'd like to start with a quote from one of my favorite authors, Maya Angelou. It says, "Do the best you can until you know better, and then when you know better, do better." It's important insight when it comes to engaging in equity work of any kind. It acknowledges that we're all just doing the best we can with the knowledge that we have. Our goal in this room here today is to learn as much as we can in order to do better for the folks around us. And many of you are already doing really amazing equity work, and it's important to acknowledge that.
And we'll start with some intros. So my name is Frank Colosimo. I am a Programs and Services Coordinator at Egale, Canada Human Rights Trust. My pronouns are he, him, and his. I was the lead of the Embodiment Project, which is about gay, bi, trans, and queer men's body image and mental health. This is a very important topic for me because of my own experiences. My gender expression and body have both been policed and shamed over the years, from when I was a very young boy to teen, to as an adult when I entered into the gay community in Toronto, and even still today. And it's important to note that gay, bi, trans, and queer men's bodies are represented so monolithically. So it's important to remember the diversity that actually does exist within communities, and even here within our little team of two.
So my name is Robbie Ahmed, and my pronouns are he, him, his. I am the Trans Program Coordinator at Egale, and I'm passionate about talking about trans men's body image experiences and from a racialized perspective. As you can see, there's a lot of diversity within the GBTQ men, and we all come from different social locations.
And so what is embodiment? So if you go to m.bodiment.ca, you'll see, we encourage you to check out the site. It is a project by Egale that was funded by the Movember Foundation, intended to open a dialogue about gay, bi, trans, and queer men's body image and health. So the main objectives were to raise awareness of body image issues among gay, bi, trans, and queer men, but also to generate that conversation around the issues and the links to health. We created a video series which has some very personal narratives of men's experiences with body image issues. We created a poster series that went up in the subway. So we created two projects, one in French and one in English, one for Toronto communities and one for Montreal communities. And so we had these posters up in our TTC in Toronto and in the Metro in Montreal. We also have a website, both in English and in French, with resources for gay, bi, trans, and queer men. And we also conducted an informal online survey. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a bit.
All right, so before we begin, we'd like to start with the acronym GBTQ. You might have seen it as LGBTQ, but you've noticed the L is missing. It's mostly because we're talking about men in this context. You also may have seen longer acronyms, and when we use these acronyms, we should remember that there's always a plus sign, as terms captured in the acronym could never fully represent all the identities of folks we're speaking about. Here at Egale, we use LGBTQI2S acronym. So take a brief moment and think about how many of these identity terms corresponding to each of these letters in the acronym you already know. You may want to take a pen and paper, scribble down the ones you know, or say them quietly to yourself.
We'll give you a second to write out the LGBTQI2S acronym, and if there's any terms in there that you can remember. All right, so how did you do? Here you see LGBTQI2S, and it's lesbian, gay, bisexual, trans, queer and questioning, intersex, and two-spirit. We don't have time to go through all the identities here today, but we will leave you with a glossary of terms with the resources that you'll be able to check out all the terms and more when you get a chance. But if anyone has any pressing questions, go ahead. Marbella is available to answer anything or direct them to us. And it's not an exhaustive list that we're using, so it's important to remember. This is an umbrella term, and it's also important to know that when you're referring to LGBTQI2S or LGBT communities or events, not to use the term gay. And I'm only mentioning that because gay is often used as a default term, like you hear gay pride or this is a gay event, when really it's not inclusive of all the identities that may be represented at that event or in that particular group. And also, we want to use a more inclusive term like LGBTQI2S because the terms that we use are constantly evolving, they're culturally specific, and they're self-determined. And so for the purpose of this webinar and for the Embodiment Project, you'll be hearing us use GBTQ, which refers to gay, bi, trans, and queer men.
All right, so regardless of the terms a person may use to frame and talk about various aspects of their identities and experiences, we have found it helpful to think of these various aspects using the visual representation displaying 4 categories of human identity that everyone can connect to, not just those under the LGBTQ umbrella. This is Jendi, the genderbread person, and maybe some of you have met Jendi before. So the 4 categories of identity are spatially represented in a strategic way. We'll start with assigned sex, which is between the legs, the gender identity, which is between the ears, gender expression outside the body, and attraction at the heart, as you may have known previously as sexual orientation. We're going to run through a quick explanation of each of these categories to get us started.
All right, so let's start. We'll start with assigned sex. So as you can see, we have it designated here between Jendi's legs because when someone is born, the doctor or the midwife or whoever it might be looks at the baby, looks between the legs and decides it's a boy or it's a girl, as they would state, and then they put an M or an F on the birth certificate. The reality, however, is that assigned sex is not just what you have going on between your legs. And before I go on, I want to say the reason we use the term assigned sex is because this sex is assigned to you at birth, and it's important to note that. But when someone is born and they assign a sex, it's not just about what's between the legs because there are essentially 4 biological components that are working together or interact together to define sex. These specific 4 pieces of biological information are external genitalia, are the internal reproductive organs or gonads, there are hormones and chromosomes. So in order for someone to categorize a person as male or female, there's an expectation that these 4 pieces of biological information are going to interact in a particular way. For example, if a baby is born with a vagina and a vulva, then it is expected that internally there will be a uterus and ovaries, and then further it's expected that there will be higher levels of estrogen and progesterone and XX chromosomes. But for many people, however, the reality is different. These 4 pieces of information can interact in a variety of different ways, The word we use to talk about these differences in sexual development is intersex. You'll notice on the screen we use a spectrum to define sex and assign sex, and it's not so black and white. It's not a binary of male and female. And so intersex might be a term that's new for some people. Have you heard of it before? Also, you may have heard the term hermaphrodite, which is a derogatory term that we do not use. But I just wanted to note that that's a term that you may have heard in the past.
All right, unlike assigned sex, which is defining what someone else's assessment of our physical bodies are, gender identity is our own inner sense of self, either identifying as a man, woman, both, or neither. That's why it's representing up there in Gendy's brain. Just as we saw on the spectrum on the last slide, gender identity is a spectrum too. There are so many more than just two options when it comes to how people experience this part of who they are. For example, I identify as a man, and so does Frank. However, our experiences of being a man are different due to cultural context, personal experience, attraction, and identity. So to sum up the difference between these two categories, in a somewhat oversimplified way, assigned sex is between your legs, whereas gender identity is between your ears. Again, that is certainly an oversimplification. Some people may experience their gender as connected to their physical bodies. But for the sake of clarifying our understanding here today, this graphic can serve as a helpful reminder.
And gender expression outside of Gendy's body. And so when we're talking about gender expression, we're talking about how we express who we are to the world, but also how gender is read on our bodies by those around us. So if I walked into a room, what assumptions might you make about my gender identity based on my gender expression? You see my beard, my hair or lack of hair, the shirt I'm wearing, and you might make some assumptions of my gender identity based on my gender expression. But there's some important things to remember about gender expression. First of all, it's culturally specific, so it depends on who, where, when. It's always going to be different where you go, when it is in time. And also it's important to note that gender identity and gender expression are separate categories. As I said, you may make assumptions of my gender identity based on my gender expression, but that's a false assumption. Many people might not have, or there might be many reasons why somebody might not have the gender expression that aligns with their gender identity. For example, somebody might not have access to the materials to express their gender the way they want. Perhaps somebody young who maybe can't buy their own lipstick or hats or whatever it might be. But also somebody might not want to express gender, their gender as they identify, because they may have been experienced bullying or harassment or even violence, or they fear experiencing bully, harassment, or violence if they express their gender as it aligns with their identity. So validating someone's gender identity should never be based on how you read their gender. It's very important to remember. And once again, we're using a spectrum here.
So the last category we'd like to talk about before moving forward is attraction, which some of you may be more familiar with as sexual orientation. The reason we use the term attraction instead of sexual orientation is that not everybody experiences sexual attraction. So when you meet a person, you may have three types of feelings, what we call the head, heart, and pants feelings. So head feelings is the intellectual, psychological attraction when you really like the way someone talks, maybe you think they're really smart or funny, and you want to spend more time together as pals. Then it comes our heart feelings, which are romantic and emotional feelings, those crush feelings that give you butterflies in the stomach and make you want to buy all the flowers in the world for them. Then we've got the pants feelings, which are the sexual, physical feelings of attraction. Those feelings that may make you say to yourself, this person is pretty hot, potentially sexy times. Some people experience all of these feelings of attraction to all the people they're attracted to, but others may experience just one or two, and we may experience shifts in how these feelings happen over a course of time. For example, the experience of having head and heart feelings but no pants feelings is called asexuality, or some people may identify as being ace, in addition to terms related to attraction such as being straight or gay. It is also worth noting that there's a big difference between attraction and behavior. Just like with gender expression, there are 1,000,001 reasons why someone might be engaged in a behavior that doesn't align with how they experience their attraction. Maybe they're still questioning and figuring out how they feel, or maybe they're under pressure of their community or afraid of possible violence or discrimination. For example, somebody may be queer and may not act on it due to the environment that they're in. But it's always remembered that people always get to self-define, no matter what, because it's never our place to judge the validity of someone else's reality.
And so the dominant equation is that society has these rigid structures around a set of assumptions about how these categories will line up. This dominant equation is, for example, if somebody was assigned male at birth, then it's expected that his gender identity would be that of a boy, or he grows up to be a man. It is expected that his gender expression would be masculine by those dominant expectations. And then it's also expected that he would be attracted to women, specifically heterosexual cisgender women. Cisgender might be a new term. We'll get to that in a couple more slides. But I just want to point out that this is a false assumption, because not all human beings are born and grow up to be cisgender, heterosexual, and conform to the dominant norms. How people express their gender and who they are attracted to is always different. And this dominant equation and these expectations of these ideals is at the root of a range of harmful ways that discrimination, exclusion, and even violence occurs for those whose identities and expressions don't line up in this particular equation. And the social pressures to conform are powerful factors that are largely included in this conversation that we're having today about men's bodies and body image specifically.
All right, so to give you an example of how this equation can align for different individuals, I'll start with my own gender. So my assigned sex at birth is female. My gender identity is that of a man, more specifically a trans man, because it doesn't align by the dominant standards of what it's expected by my assigned sex. My gender expression is masculine. We'll put masculine in quotations because it's a loaded term and has different meanings to different people. And my experience of attraction is being straight because I'm attracted to women.
Excellent. And we'll do my gender, for example, as well. So I was assigned male at birth. My gender identity is a man, and we use the term cisgender man because it is a more inclusive term. Cisgender means that the sex that I was assigned at birth is aligned with my gender identity according to the dominant standards. So I was assigned male, I identify as a man, that's cisgender. And we don't want to use the term normal. We use cisgender as a more inclusive term, of course. My gender expression is masculine. Once again, I also put quotations around it because it's such a loaded term. It means so many different things to different people. And I wouldn't want people to just think that I am identifying by these dominant standards of masculinity. And the terms that I use to talk about my experience of attraction are gay and queer. So take a minute and think about what your gender looks like. You could draw your own gender and fill in your own blanks. All right. And so when we're talking about gender expression, we use the man box, and it's a good visual tool because the characteristics inside this box represent a narrowly conceived definition of manhood and masculinity. We could see some of these terms. For instance, some very obvious ones like the one at the top right, not showing weakness or vulnerability, not crying or showing emotion. I'm sure we're all familiar that the expectations of men are to have these characteristics. You could think of some other ones as well. And so when expectations of what it means to be a man is not fulfilled, when they're not fulfilled, then boys and men are subject to ridicule, isolation, threats to personal safety, even violence. And these messages are powerfully reinforced through institutions and embedded in everyday language, even within queer communities. So there's the same dominant ideals of masculinity and manhood that are imposed on us by other queer people, by other trans men, by other gay men. And it's not just, you may assume, by straight men. And so we as gay, bi, trans, and queer men often impose those same expectations and ideals and scrutiny on ourselves and others within our community, unfortunately. It's just as dangerous and damaging, obviously. Some examples of some phrases and insults that you may have heard directed at boys who fail to conform to these norms. I'm going to put them on the screen here. And maybe you can think of some others too. But these are terms that we've heard before directed at boys or men who do not conform to the expectations of masculinity by the dominant standards. Oops, sorry.
Perhaps you can think of a time, or some of you many times, when you were told you weren't doing gender exactly right. Think about how that made you feel. When experience of being gender policed happen frequently, the accumulated impact over time is profound. What do you think the impact of being target of ongoing and relentless gender policing may be? And by the term gender policing, we mean to describe how the man box is being maintained and protected. So there's a brief clip on the embodiment video series that you can find on the website where these men in the video touch on some of the very questions and reflect on their own relationship to masculinity. In the video series, subjects were asked to remove items of clothing based on questions relating to masculinity, safety in gendered spaces, and body image. As such, many of the subjects in the film are nude. So we'll give you, you can watch those videos on your own time.
Yeah, at m.bodiment.ca you can see the whole video series, and we definitely encourage you to check it out when we're done here. And so what was interesting when we were creating the video project, and what you'll see in the video is, though everyone has a very unique experience, everyone's story is different, there was a commonality. Everyone was directly negatively impacted by toxic masculinity in one way or another. So some of the reflections from the participants in the videos you're going to see are making strong connections between the impositions of dominant masculinity and receiving forceful messages about what men's bodies are supposed to look like physically. The powerful and cultural messages about masculinity are closely linked to idealized standards of appearance for men. And that dictates the narrow ideals of how men's physical bodies should look. For example, young, white, muscular, cisgender men are mostly represented, overrepresented, and celebrated within contemporary media and gay culture, therefore accepted as the most attractive. And so this pervasiveness of toxic masculinity, fat phobia, body shaming, ageism, racism, it's in all of the institutions around us, like fashion, education, media, healthcare, you name it. They all essentially are perpetuating these same messages that are damaging to gay, bi, trans, and queer men, and creating these expectations of bodies that are unachievable.
Of course, all men are impacted by the constraints of the dominant masculinity, but the impact on the GBTQ men can be especially profound, and this all comes back to the fact that we're embedded in a social system that structures sex and gender in a false binary and hierarchy. The idealized masculine body is firmly anchored in what we call cis-heteropatriarchy. Society positions cisgender and heterosexual men and masculinity as separate from and superior to women, femininity, and being gay, trans, or gender nonconforming. As a result, being gay, trans, or gender nonconforming is positioned as wholly opposite to being masculine. Being quote-unquote like a woman, or having qualities thought as being feminine, or occupying a body that is read as female is equated to a lesser social value, a loss or denial of power. The real man narrative treats queer men are less than 100% men. Since manhood is held at such a premium, queer and trans men are often internalized homophobic and transphobic gender policing, and may even driven to overcompensate given to their masculinity has been questioned or threatened. I know in my own personal experiences, when I used to use the gym, I would have to head nod or overlift other men, or try to do so that I'm not being read as trans.
That overcompensating, I can relate to that too. When I was in my early 20s, I used to use the term fag as a derogatory term in reference to other gay guys when I was talking with my straight friends. And I thought it was a way that I could connect with them because I associated this masculinity with this homophobia. Essentially, I was just being homophobic. And so these experiences of shame and marginalization in relation to our bodies and our gender expression, it's pervasive in the gay, bi, trans, and queer communities. But why are so few people talking about it or talking openly about it? Discourse around body image and healthcare is often centered around the experiences of cisgender women, mostly, as you would know. But as we've seen, men, and especially GBTQ men, face similar pressures to be leaner, to be more muscular. And so the context and reasoning is a little bit different from women's. So while women are expected or taught that being thin will make them attractive to men, and men are taught that being muscular will make them appear more stronger and capable, gay men are taught to want to appear stronger and more capable and be attractive to other men. So body scrutiny becomes cyclical, body insecurity becomes cyclical. We project the same gatekeeping on other men that we do on ourselves. And so this just keeps going round and round. And so we had a survey where we asked some gay, bi, trans, and queer men about their experiences with body image. And this is infographic on your screen here on the first one there. Talks about, have you been rejected by someone based on your body? And the results obviously are significant. 73% of the respondents said that they were rejected by someone because of the way their body shape or size was. We saw that 63% were rejected because of age. There's a big issue with ageism within gay and queer communities. And also, we see 29% were rejected because of their race. I imagine that this number is quite low because of the demographics, perhaps, of the folks that responded. Because if you speak to any non-white gay, bi, trans, or queer men, most of them have had that experience of being rejected because of race. This is just from my own anecdotal experience of conversations. And then the second question we have here is, have you ever held yourself back from doing something because you didn't want others to see your body? This question was inspired by my own experience. I did not go to a water park or a public pool or anywhere where someone would see me shirtless for almost all of my life.
Yeah, and similarly, I have avoided water parks, pools, and gyms because I would not want to use the change room, and I wouldn't want people to know that I'm trans from my body. But also it's important to remember that we've got a lot going on and no one can be defined by just one dimension. And since queer and trans men have also got a lot going on, it's important to remember that gender and attraction are not the only categories that shape our lives and the experiences of moving through the world, especially when it comes to experiences of body image, masculinity, and desirability. Now, take a look at each of the petals and think about your own identity in relation to each of them. Can you think of other petals that you might add? For me, my identity is of that of a trans identity, racialized identity, and of a young person. And they can be seen as one or the other. They all work in relation to each other. And because we have a lot going on, including queer and trans men, it's important to remember that some may experience homophobia, biphobia, and or transphobia in combination with other forms of discrimination. This can be layered and complex. Ultimately, systems of oppressions are most often systems in which some bodies and identities are considered inherently valuable and held in opposition to others which are devalued and considered undesirable.
And so all forms of oppression need to be challenged and confronted, not just homophobia, biphobia, and transphobia. When we're talking about men's bodies, specifically gay, bi, trans, and queer men's bodies, we need to look at and challenge ageism, ableism, racism, classism, fat phobia, sexism, misogyny. The list goes on, essentially. So another video that we recommend you check out is the embodiment video called Preferences. You'll hear about some of the embodiment ambassadors talking about body image in regards to their social location, talking about age, shape, size, and race. So once again, we recommend you check out this video.
And as you can see, there's a hierarchy of desirability and preferences, and we hear these messages all the time in dating apps and clubs. So here's a quote from one of the bloggers on hiskind.com. You'll find it in our reference list. So it says, "Our attractions and fetishes are a cultural phenomenon. They are a product of our surroundings. No, your tastes in men, your fetishes, your attitudes towards dating are all products of the society you grew up in. We are complicit in this system of superficiality and exclusion that is making too many men within today's generation of gay men insecure, discontented, and depressed."
So within gay culture, there are subcultures. that are labeled based on body type. You may have heard of some of them. You may have heard of twink or bear or otter, for example. And so essentially they're created to and used to filter out who people find attractive and not attractive based on body types. Once again, even within these subgroups, there is an idealized masculinity, and then there are always those who fall through those cracks. There's always going to be that hierarchy of attractiveness. And so, for example, younger, thinner boys are designated as twinks, often seen as too femme. Bears are expected to have a certain amount of muscle and fur, sometimes fat, sometimes too much fat, sometimes not enough fat. It goes on. And you'll see this t-shirt on this person on the screen here that says no fats, no femmes is taken from no fats, no femmes, no Asians, no blacks, which is a disgusting mantra that is frequently seen on gay dating apps. Even now, today, you'll still see it. It's not only deeply racist, but also homophobic, femphobic, fatphobic. It also perpetuates these same ideals of attractiveness that can make GBTQ men feel insecure, discontented, and depressed, as the quote has it here.
So many dating apps require you to select the tribes you're attracted to in order to continue. They're almost never trans-inclusive, which excludes trans men from those spaces completely. A lot of racialized men tend to put themselves as mixed race because they experience feelings of shame and want to appear to be less racialized. There's also a certain amount of shadeism where people just want to appear lighter skinned due to their race. To emphasize the point even further, just to take a look at these telling snapshots from gay dating app profiles.
And so these are actual screenshots from actual profiles taken recently. And let's not spend too much time on those. So as we see, we have a lot of strong anecdotal evidence for just how damaging all of this is. Though there's some research out there, there's not enough. Gay and bi men are disproportionately impacted by eating disorders and body image issues. Research suggests that gay and bi men are at least 10 times more likely to be impacted than heterosexual men. Research is also beginning to link trans and non-binary gender identity to heightened likelihood of negative body images and eating disorder diagnosis, but still not enough. And so these unhealthy standards promote harmful behaviors. Gay, bi, trans, and queer men are disproportionately affected by eating disorders, unhealthy exercise disorders, steroid use, negative body image and self-esteem, reluctance to participate in activities, negative impact on relationships, and more.
So in addition to the lack of research, knowledge, and services for GBTQ men with eating disorders or body image concerns, the Embodiment Project found that there were also a number of implicit and explicit barriers to accessing healthcare, improper care received, and many forms of discrimination experienced within the healthcare spaces. So we're going to read some of the quotes for the embodiment participants. Some complaints like fatigue, depression, anxiety, or low self-esteem seem less important when it comes from a man.
And talking to cis doctors, that's cis for cisgender, talking to cis doctor about LGBTQ plus issues can be difficult. I need to go in great depth to really get them to understand. And this really speaks to the gap in knowledge and information, essentially, of queer identities.
So what are some of those barriers? So we've got physical barriers, such as long wait lists, especially for trans care. We've got financial constraints and location. There are also social barriers, such as lack of knowledge and understanding of LGBTQ identities by healthcare professionals, lack of LGBTQI2S healthcare professionals, and, of course, fear of disclosure. There's also discrimination within the healthcare settings, like dead naming or calling somebody by their legal assigned at birth name, non-inclusive intake forms and practices, and rejection of services. And I know from my own personal experience, when I had to do my medical checkup for my immigration to get my permanent residency, I was rejected from it because my ID appeared to be a little bit more feminine than I was presenting at that time, so they refused to do any of the blood tests on me.
And so also, if you check out the Trans Pulse study, which is a very popular study of trans folks within Ontario, 1 in 10 trans person was rejected from medical services completely, just as Robbie was. And if you go to m.bodiment.ca/healthcare, you'll see more information about this, but also you'll get to see some recommendations on how you can as a healthcare provider, make a more safer space for LGBTQI2S patients. So how can you make safer spaces for LGBTQ men, patients, clients, people? And we use the term safer specifically because even though a lot of work can be done, you can never guarantee that a space is fully safe. But there's a lot of good things you can do. There's a lot of work. We'll provide you with some helpful information. For example, if you want to make your spaces safer for LGBTQI2S people, think of your practices, think of your own social location when you're working. It's helpful to remember to listen to other voices who are from a different social location than your own. It's also important to consider you and your staff having a good understanding of LGBTQI2S identities, language, and overarching cultural concepts. So perhaps taking awareness training would be beneficial. Think of your intake form as well within your clinic. Is it inclusive of non-hetero relationships and non-binary and trans identities? Think about the clinic space that you have as well. Is it inclusive? Do all the posters, artwork, and pamphlets only represent heterosexual and cisgender identities and people? Think about the language that you're using as well. Are you doing a pronoun check-in with your clients, using the correct pronouns that they go by? Are you gender affirming? Are you respecting your client's gender identity? What I mean by that is, for example, if your patient or client was born assigned male at birth but identifies as a woman, do you respect them as a woman and refer to them by the pronouns that they choose? And also, are you body affirming? Do you use body affirming statements, giving alternative ways to cope or allow folks to have a body? Because every body is different, essentially, and all bodies are inherently valuable.
Yes, and are you making sure that they're gender-neutral washrooms? Gender-neutral washrooms are very important.
Yeah, of course. So lots of things to think of. And so there's a growing movement pushing back against body shaming and gender policing and fat phobia in queer spaces and trans men's spaces and communities that rejects the general cultural attitudes that fatness is scary, unlovable, or wrong in any way.
And whether you're talking about your own body or someone's outfit of choice or what they're having for lunch, be mindful of your words and what they may imply and perpetrate about bodies. Remember that men have eating disorders too, and bodies come in all shapes and sizes.
I'm going to read a quote from the embodiment participant. It says, "I believe that we need to stop describing ourselves as what we are not, and we need to teach the world to see the beauty and desirability in every body. These pressures are experienced as individual, but as we've seen, they're also connected to larger forces. And so there's really a lot of power in honesty and open dialogue about body image and sharing our experiences. So embodiment is part of this wider body positivity activism movement, and that we also encourage you to take into your practices as well." I'll end with one last quote. "Our bodies aren't wrong, the system is wrong. Any system that makes us believe our bodies are somewhat wrong is a bad system. We need to shift our thinking. All bodies are good bodies. We need to rethink what we find attractive and ask ourselves why we think the way that we do. And we need to talk about it. We need to talk about all of it." So thanks so much for participating and your attention today. If you have more questions, we have also our email addresses available for you here.
Yep.
And we can now open the floor to any Q&A that may have come up. If there's anything in particular, Marbella, that anyone has asked?
Nobody's asked any questions.
There's one.
There's one that asked, "Is the presentation going to be available for review at a later date?" Yes, it has been recorded, and we're going to be sending it out to everybody who's registered along with the slides. And Frank and Robbie are going to be providing us with some extra resources and information that we're going to share with all participants as well.
Perfect.
Yeah.
All right, so thank you very much, everyone, for your time and your attention today.
Oh, there's one more question?
Oh,
no, there wasn't.
Same one? Okay.
And thank you, Frank and Robbie, for the informative and wonderful webinar and for all of the work that you do. Thank you so much.
All right, thanks, folks.
Bye, everybody. Thank you.